Following the success of Silent Hill 2's remake, Bloober Team now tries its hand at something new, but fairly familiar. Cronos: The New Dawn is a time-traveling survival horror title set in a post-apocalyptic version of Poland, where fleshy abominations and structural anomalies are the only thing left standing. According to Bloober Team, Cronos is a project close to their hearts, being set in the 1980s Nowa Huta, which is a Polish district where many of the team's members grew up. This in-depth expertise and familiarity with the setting pay off tremendously, as the game's locations feel like they've been plucked straight from a memory, rich and deeply rooted in history. Cronos is a great example of the expression, write what you know being put into action, but can familiarity create a masterpiece? So with all that being said, let's review Cronos: The New Dawn in this Game Sandwich review. Observing the New World. Cronos puts us in the shoes of ND-3576, also known as the Traveler, whose role is to travel back in the past in search of individuals who could alter the timeline. The Traveler's main goal is to probe the minds of key figures to look for ways to stop the change, which is a catastrophic disease that turned humanity into diseased, fleshy monstrosities. To withstand time travel, the Traveler wears a temporal shell, similar to a slim version of BioShock's Big Daddy suit. The temporal shell is a striking part of Cronos' visual identity, but it also fulfills the ludonarrative job of restraining the player's movement abilities, helping dictate the pacing of combat. Every encounter plays into the main character's bulkiness, as combat relies on charged shots and careful aiming, as well as luring enemies into traps while positioning yourself against multiple targets. The methodical approach to combat pays off greatly, as you are consistently tense with the knowledge that running away isn't really a viable plan. Having the enemies hide, blend into the scenario, or play dead also forces you to be extra aware of the environment at all times. It's difficult to think that any games in recent memory that had us examining our surroundings more often, which, weirdly enough, gave us a lot of appreciation of Cronos' well-crafted locations. This focus on the environment feels like a level designer cheat code, and that's all to make players appreciate their surroundings rather than just rushing through it. Doing what works. Bloober Team doesn't seem to play coy about what inspires them, as Cronos pulls from a lot of established survival horror franchises. One of the more obvious comparisons we can make to it is Dead Space, as the main character wears a big bulky suit, explores levels by manipulating the environment, and fights fleshy abominations with dissected limbs, which is about as Dead Space as you can get without being an outright sequel. Looking closer, we can also spot some of the modern Resident Evil DNA, like the minimalistic UI, inventory management, puzzle design, and boss fights cramped into spaces. The main difference between Cronos and the titles it does take inspiration from, however, is how it takes some of those pieces and creates something mechanically similar, but with its own unique identity, ending up much larger than some of its parts. One thing to note is that Cronos is very light on puzzles, focusing almost entirely on combat and exploitation. Most of the legwork the player does pertains to finding keys and access codes to doors, which are always pretty straightforward and doesn't require too much thinking, which in turn makes it a more reasonably linear experience. But there is some challenge in figuring out what the way forward is, requiring a good sense of direction and map awareness. But those who have set expectations for the survival horror genre will definitely be disappointed by the lack of brain teasers, as this is more of a rip and tear sort of game. Dynamic encounters. Cronos' main enemies are orphans, who happen to be previously deceased humans now mutated into fleshy creatures who create nests of organic materials. The orphans come in multiple sizes and types, sometimes spitting acid or being covered in hardened plates, which if you try to shoot them, they're gonna deflect your bullets. But they all have one shared ability, being merging. If left unchecked, an orphan can merge with nearby corpses to gain multiple special mutations, functionally becoming a mini-boss who snowballs your progress against you. This in turn creates a very dynamic combat system, where you are constantly forced to keep track of the more dangerous enemy types, using your limited flamethrower ammo to burn the more dangerous bodies before they cause further mutations. Fire is the overall precious resource that needs to be carefully managed, as it's one of the only very few things that will stun the orphans long enough to give you a breather during combat. Cronos' encounters constantly require the player to act fast and make tough choices, since hesitating to use your items could put you in a more worse situation. Fire also has its uses outside of combat. Fire could also be used to burn down barriers that could lead to rooms with more ammo and items, making it a more difficult resource to let go even outside of combat. A survival horror game lives and dies by its weapons, and thankfully we are glad to report that Cronos' weapons feel as heavy as the protagonist himself, providing an excellent visual and auditory feedback while shredding through enemies. The game's starting handgun, confusingly named the Sword, puts in enough work to be relevant from beginning to end, thanks to its charge shot mechanic, which when fully upgraded, bullies bosses and elite enemies. Unfortunately, there are no dismemberment mechanics or a cutting weapon in general, which feels like a missed opportunity considering the game's inspirations. A disposable existence. Survival horror is a genre that used to tell deeply personal stories, usually pertaining to the rescue of a loved one or a desperate need for survival. But Cronos does it best to show that the travelers are no bigger than their missions. They might have a very important job, but they're not important themselves. This is best exemplified by how the game starts, with the main character being woken up from an induced sleep, only to be immediately given orders on how to continue a failed mission. This no-frills introduction serves to how we are simply just another body thrown at a problem. And in the very likely event that we do fail, a replacement is lined up and ready to continue where we left off. The expression, "such is our calling," comes up often, as a way to show that the travelers are duty-bound to their cause in almost a religious manner. The vaguely religious symbolism is also present in the process of activating a new traveler, which happens to be called the Lazarus Protocol. Cronos' plot is filled with themes of identity, as the game's depersonalized and faceless protagonist extracts each target's essence, which is the very thing that makes them unique, condemning them to an unnatural existence, all for the sake of answers. The conversations we have inside the phylactery, where the essence are held, drip with anger and regret, both tormenting and humanizing the almost robotic traveler. Spooky moments. Cronos is definitely on the action side of things as far as survival horror goes, especially since the player is more well equipped to handle most situations. But that doesn't mean saving the world is a walk in the park. Most encounters are one-sided, as the game constantly sets up ambushes by having enemies crawl their way out of flesh piles, breaking through doors, or by having unassuming corpses come back to life. Difficult combat is a surefire way to keep your audience well engaged and scared. And even some of us who don't react to horror in such a way, we have to admit, Cronos made us jump more than once, thanks to its crafty enemy placement. Some of the game's horror elements are ramped up, especially as you extract essence and fill up your phylactery, carrying the memories of your targets in the past. Walking around with the phylactery full of essence gives the player different passive buffs, like increased headshot damage and faster movement speed when aiming. But this also results in jump scares, as the traveler becomes more haunted by violent memories of the target's lives. These jump scares unfortunately did not feel earned, or as effective as tense moments that the game creates through the atmosphere and enemy ambushes, ending up more annoying and disruptive than actually scary. These half-baked attempts at horror start to really feel frequent during the game's second half, genuinely hurting what would have been an overall fantastic horror experience. The almighty Unreal Engine 5. On the PC side of things, Cronos boasts reasonably modern hardware requirements, listing an Intel Core i7 10700K CPU and RTX 3080 GPU as the recommended hardware, which feels understandable considering the game is quite a looker. Despite being an Unreal Engine 5 title, performance is incredibly smooth for the most part, with no lighting issues or stutters. Although some areas of the game are prone to frame drops, usually the ones that are filled to the brim with enemies and organic goop. The PC version has a great amount of customization options, including uncapped frame rates, support for ultra-wide resolutions, frame generation, a lengthy list of advanced settings, and pretty much everything else you'd expect from a competent modern release. This in turn makes Cronos serve as this pretty decent benchmark for new hardware, as well as a solid candidate for one of the better optimized Unreal Engine 5 games released this year. The final verdict. From beginning to end, Cronos manages to be a highly engaging and immersive survival horror experience, featuring tough combat encounters, tense exploration sequences, and an overall fantastic plot. It goes down incredibly easy, with its 16-hour runtime making a graceful exit before it overstays its welcome. For those who want to do more though, there are some post-game unlockables like a new game plus and armor skins, as well as multiple endings and different rankings to achieve. It becomes increasingly apparent as you play through it that Cronos is a passion project, and one of those titles that the studio manages to finally develop after hitting it big with a commercially successful release. Following something like Silent Hill 2 with an entirely new horror IP takes a lot of confidence, but that bold move has certainly paid off, as Bloober Team's vision and execution are tremendously impressive. But with all that being said, Game Sandwich would like to give Cronos the New Dawn a 9 out of 10. If you did happen to enjoy today's video or want more gaming content just like this, keep it locked to Game Sandwich for all your gaming news, rumors, and reviews. I've been K-Lo, and I'll see you guys next time.